Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss audit quality. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. Now, of course, we all want to do a good audit and a quality audit, but the problem is it's difficult to define what a good audit is. Does it mean we find all the material and misstatements that exist? And the first problem with that definition, it would be hard to show that everything was found. And for instance, you may have an error that self-corrects next year. So for instance, if there was an error in inventory valuation, you had an annual inventory valuation as opposed to a perpetual system, or even, I guess, in a perpetual system, if there was an error one year and it just fixed itself up next year, no one would ever notice, perhaps. People might wonder, why was income so low or so high this year and then the opposite way next year, but they would never notice the error. The other thing, I guess, is maybe there's 100 errors and the auditor finds 99 out of 100. Is that a good audit? They missed one really big error. Did they do a good audit or not? Certainly, the public would believe that you'd messed up because you missed a material misstatement. You're supposed to find them. The other thing, I guess, and there are some clients who are very, very diligent about getting their financial statements right, there may be no material misstatements existing in the first place. So a bad audit, a sloppy audit, would look the same as a good one because no material misstatements subsequently came up that the auditor had missed. So kind of the bad thing that occurs is the definition becomes compliance with standards. And that's really bad if it becomes that your objective as an auditor is to document it so it looks like you met the standards, whether or not you did or not. You're just preparing pretty documentation. And this was from a long time ago. I was talking to a colleague, and he told me how he had this audit, and it was inspected. His working papers were inspected, and he was told that he had a number of deficiencies in his audit because his documentation was poor. Well, the following year he lost the audit, and a big firm got the audit and did the audit, gave a clean opinion, and then for whatever reason in the third year he got it back. And when he got it back, he looked at the prior year's statements, did some risk assessment procedures, and said, well, this is wrong. Here's a material misstatement in the audit, or in the financial statements that you missed in the audit. And then he said to me, you know, this was a big, well-known firm that did it. Would the inspector have looked at their file and said, oh, what beautiful documentation, you must have done a good audit? Well, they missed something, so they didn't do a good audit, but they documented compliance with standards and missed something. Now, I don't know why the error was missed. I just know that it was. So unfortunately, documentation has become the focus of an evaluation of quality, and even more unfortunately, what I see people doing, and I hear colleagues talking about, is they're saying, well, shouldn't we do something to make the inspector happy? Shouldn't we do some kind of testing like this? And then when the inspector looks at the file, they'll go, oh, what a good audit you did. And they're not doing the testing or the procedures as a focus of risk of material misstatement. They're trying to make a pretty file. And they're not being done as part of a good quality audit. So what I think we need to try to do is we want to focus on doing a good audit, strive to have good documentation flow from that, but don't make documentation the focus of the audit. Make a quality audit the focus of the audit, and hope that documentation comes from that. So I think we have to rise above the definition, documented compliance with standards, and rather, and this is a subtle difference, I guess, but we need to focus on the standards. The standards actually are really good, and they really tell us the things that we should be doing in an audit. Don't fall back on just making up some pretty documentation to put in the file to make it look like we did a good audit, because you will eventually get caught. Now, as an aside, here are some inspector criticisms that I recently read. And the first one was not maintaining control of confirmations. Well, there's no excuse for that. We all know how to maintain control over preparation and mailing and receipt. So that's important and simple and standard. So we should absolutely do that. I guess one of my solutions, though, would be before you decide to send out confirmations, because it looks like a quick and easy procedure. Oh, we'll just send out some confirmations. Problem with that is none of the confirmations come back. So at the very end of the audit, you're dashing to do alternative procedures on the ones that didn't come in. So be sure you need to do confirmations. And if risk of material misstatement is low, you may not. Now, on the other hand, if risk of material misstatement is high and you decide to do confirmations and you don't maintain control of those confirmations, you may well allow an error to slip through in the audit and you've done a bad audit. So you've got to maintain control of confirmations. Samples that were not representative. Now, of course, if you wish to be able to draw a conclusion about a population, the sample has to be representative. Now, you don't have to do a statistical sample for it to be representative. You may decide to make the sample size a little bigger than it would otherwise need to be if it was statistical, but you don't have to do a statistical sample. The other thing is sometimes when you're sampling, or I guess you're actually not sampling, let's say you have a population where there are 5 large items and then a bunch of small things that don't even add up to anywhere close to materiality. You could probably conclude, well, I don't need to draw a conclusion about the things I didn't test because the things I didn't test couldn't possibly be materially misstated. So looking at the 5 big ones is a satisfactory test. And you would need to document that and explain that. Poor analytical procedures. This also I'm a little surprised at because analytical procedures are one of the most powerful, possibly if you can use them, and easiest procedures. So it should be our first stop in every component for every assertion. So we should do it and do it right. Now the problem is for an analytical procedure to work and give you evidence, you need an expectation, and there may not be one. And what I see people sometimes doing is trying to force or manufacture an expectation and then doing an analytical procedure and find that it agrees to the expectation. So don't do that. And testing data used for analytical procedures. If you're doing days sales and receivables, you need the client's sales number and you need the client's receivable number, which come from their systems. So if you have not tested the controls, for instance, in that system, because that would be a way of testing the data used in the analytical procedure, you have no basis for the analytical procedure. So again, my first stop here would be to say, well, did we test controls? Did we do a systems walkthrough or something to test controls rather than just understanding the controls? So that's another important thing, and we have to do that. It's in standards. It's very clear. Planning is another key component of quality, and I see colleagues tell me that they're trying to skip planning or cut corners on planning, and that's going to be the biggest quality mistake you make. You have to do risk assessment procedures, and risk assessment procedures can be analytical procedures. Now, when they're done as a risk assessment procedure, no expectation is needed, and they don't need to be real complicated. They can just be, well, what's this number this year compared to last year? Is that kind of what I expect? Or is it suddenly much larger than I expect or much smaller? And does that mean that it could contain a material misstatement? You also have to understand internal control. You don't have to test it, but why not? Because I find it very difficult to just understand control and not test it at the same time. You can do it, but it's a lot of effort to stop from testing the control. And it's so fundamental that I think we should just test internal control in almost all circumstances. Now, there was one audit I remember where the entire interim audit file, long listing of tests, did 50 items, 49 of them failed. Conclusion, Internal control doesn't work, but that's okay because we do an all substantive audit at year end over and over and over and over and over again. And I said, why are we doing an interim audit? Controls don't work. We've already concluded that they don't work. We're not using them as a source of audit satisfaction. We do a full substantive audit at year end. And people went, oh, yeah, I guess we could just stop doing the interim. And we did. Planning is key. Partner and key staff are to do planning. Not everybody needs to be involved, though we do need to communicate the results of the planning to those that were not involved. And next, assess risk of material misstatement. Don't forget the financial statement or overall level. It's not hard to do. It's not hard to assess it. Normally it's okay. And the response is also not hard, but do it, assess it, and think about whether there's something you need to do in response. We have to assess risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. It's really important to do, and it's required to do this by assertion. Now, the reason you have to do it by assertion is audit procedures are typically directed at a particular assertion. So you got to be careful that the audit procedure you selected actually corresponds to the assertion at risk. So if your assertion at risk is bad debt expense may be not right, or allowance for doubtful accounts may be not right, and you decide to respond to that by agreeing a bunch of invoices to the accounts receivable subledger, well, that's a really nice test, but it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not allowance for doubtful accounts is sufficient. So do your planning, assess risk of material misstatement by assertion, document it, and of course, revise it as needed. Now, the overall response, as I said, it's simple. Use professional skepticism, and of course we're going to do that in every audit. Maybe we need more supervision. Maybe we need more experienced staff. If we can't find more experienced staff, then we need even more supervision. The other thing we can do is be unpredictable. Change up what procedures we do more at year end and less at interim, do more substantive testing and less control testing, visit more or other locations. Now, the smaller the audit, the less possible it is to be predictable because we have fewer choices of how we would perform the audit. The larger the audit, if you've got 100 locations and you conclude that, overall risks up this year, I'm worried about stuff. Well, maybe instead of visiting 2 locations, we visit 10 locations. Don't know the right answer, but think about that. And after we've done that, design and perform procedures. Now, the way standards are now written, it sort of assumes that controls are tested because it says, do your risk assessment procedures. And it kind of assumes that we've done risk assessment procedures and not just documented and understood control, but also tested it to see if it was actually working. And because we've done analytical procedures probably during planning, and it would be a cool thing if we could extend those to year end because they would provide some evidence, and we've already tested controls, then it says design and perform the remaining substantive procedures. And you could design some additional control tests, I suppose, but it sort of assumes that we've already got some evidence because we tested control, and of course we did some analytical procedures that we've documented properly. The other thing we have to do, and this is often missed, you've got to document the linkage of procedures done to the risks identified, and I see that missed a lot. Often we will say, okay, here's my assessment of risk of material misstatement, and here are the procedures I plan to do, but you've also got to come to a conclusion that the procedures you plan to do were successfully performed and address the risks you identified. So that loop back, that linkage back, must be documented. And I forget quality and forget documentation. You're going to do the audit wrong if you don't consider that and you don't do that linkage back. So it's really, really important, not just for the purpose of having a prettily documented file, really important for doing the audit right. Some deficiencies I see, people skip planning or delegate it down below the partner to the most junior person on the staff. Well, that just makes for a mess at the end because the reviewer will raise possibly silly issues or issues that should have been raised as part of planning. No assessment of risk material misstatement by assertion. Well, you have to, and you won't know if your testing addresses the risk of material misstatement you've identified if you don't. So you've got to do that. And linkage, and as I said before, you often see this or only hinted at, particularly when your identification of risk of material misstatement was poor. And you need to be able to conclude that the testing addressed the risks identified. So those are important things to do. So I think there's a subtle difference. There's a subtle difference between an audit that focuses on quality, understands and follows the standards, and is documented in accordance with the standards. And I differentiate that from what I sometimes see, an audit that focuses on preparing pretty documentation to make it look as if standards have been followed. So the first one is the best one. Focus on quality, understand and follow the standards, and hopefully your documentation will just flow from that. And you may need to pause at the end and say, oh, I did this thing, I forgot to document it. That helps me document my compliance with standards. I should make sure that I document that. And as I said, quality flows from a commitment to doing good work, an understanding of why standards want certain things, understand why the standard setters said assess risk by assertions, because your audit procedures address specific assertions. And then quality flows from following the standards. And documentation, I hope, should then flow from all of that stuff and should be almost automatic, and it shouldn't be an additional exercise. So, thanks for listening.